Hey guys, Construction Monk here. Welcome. Today we are beginning a new series entitled Let My People Go. And there's going to be episodes. And this is episode 1. And episode 1 is entitled Gatekeepers. Of course, this is a Construction Monk podcast. I'm your host, J. Randall Stewart. So, let's get into the conversation. Well, I want to talk to you about the structure of church, the way that local churches carry out the mission of Christ in the world and how they're failing, right? And this is where the conversation has been going, right? We've been talking about the church, what the church is, what the church isn't, how it's organized. And so I want to take some time to be completely frank, completely open about the state of the church and the state of the local church. What we're going to do is we're going to start and kind of just stay today in two different passages, one Old Testament, one New. One is Ezekiel chapter 34, and the other is John chapter 10. And we won't, go through every single verse in either of those chapters, but both of these chapters are about, guess what? What do you think they're about? They're about sheep and shepherds, right? And in John chapter 10, Jesus makes this specific reference to church leaders or spiritual leaders, religious leaders, calling them gatekeepers, right? So there's a really interesting interplay between the prophet Ezekiel and what God speaks through him about the shepherds of Israel, and then Jesus as the good shepherd that comes to liberate the Jewish people and bring a new message, right? And Jesus, of course, in John chapter 10 calls himself the good shepherd, but there's a specific reference to Jesus as the good shepherd in Ezekiel chapter 34. So let's start there. Ezekiel chapter 34, verse 1. Then this message came to me from the Lord. Okay, guys, this is like, bam, straight from the mouth through the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel's saying, look, this is straight from God. So, pay attention, people. All right. Verse 2. Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds, the leaders of Israel. Give them this message from the sovereign Lord. What sorrow awaits you shepherds who feed yourselves instead of your flocks? Shouldn't shepherds feed their sheep? You drink the milk, wear the wool, and butcher the best animals, but you let your flocks starve. You have not taken care of the weak. You have not tended the sick or bound up the injured. You have not gone looking for those who have wandered away and are lost. Instead, you have ruled them with harshness and cruelty. So, my sheep have been scattered without a shepherd, and they are easy prey for any wild animal. I want to stop there though, okay, for a sec. So we're going to just look for a minute through verses 1 and 5. But then we're going to get into some of the other chapters or verses in Ezekiel chapter 34, okay? God sends Ezekiel and he says what? Prophesy against the shepherds. And in case there was any ambiguity, he says, oh yeah, I mean the leaders of Israel. And he's saying, you guys are like shepherds. My people are like the sheep. But I'm telling Ezekiel to prophesy against these shepherds. Prophecy. Prophecy is not foretelling the future, guys. Generally, in the Old Testament, prophecy is God giving a specific, clear word of rebuke through a person. And so this is what we see. And God is saying, I want my mouthpiece, Ezekiel, to bring a direct critique and charge against the leaders, the spiritual leaders of the nation of Israel. And what is that critique? What is that charge from God to the leaders? Basically, he's saying, you guys are simply using my people for your own benefit. Bam! That's it. That's the whole of the picture. God's like, I've set this whole thing up so that you would take care of my people, feed them spiritually, make sure that they are right with me and right relationship with me. I've given the law. Typically the priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the religious leaders, they knew the law, they could read. They were the ones that espoused the law to the Jews. They also facilitated the temple and the sacrifices that were required. But when you had a question about what to do, you'd go to the priest and you'd ask, okay, what am I supposed to do? What's the law say? What is it that I'm supposed to do to remain in right standing with God? And God's saying, religious leaders are to be like shepherds, caring for the sheep. But the whole paradigm has been flipped. The shepherds are simply taking care of themselves and using the sheep to feed themselves and fuel their own selfish desires. And God's like, you drink the milk, you wear the wool, you butcher the best for your food, but you let them starve. You don't take care of the weak, you haven't tended the sick, you don't bound up the injured, you don't go looking for those who have wanted. Like, God's just going through all the different particular daily, weekly functions of a shepherd and how they would look after their sheep. Why? Because they cared about the sheep. They were there to care for the sheep. But God's like, you guys have become shepherds that don't care for the sheep. You care about yourselves, right? Because he says in verse 2 at the end, shouldn't shepherds feed their sheep? And then backing up in verse 2, he says, what sorrow awaits you, shepherds, who feed yourselves instead of your flocks. So it's the idea. It's a complete reversal of the leadership paradigm that God had intended concerning the spiritual leaders of Israel and those they were meant to tend. But like I said, God's just getting warmed up here, right? And remember, what we are going to relate this to is the church of today, right? So keep that in mind, but we're going to continue. So Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 7 through 10, that section is entitled, The Shepherds Removed. And so God's brought this charge against the shepherds, and now he spends the next couple verses, basically saying, you guys are out. Now we're going to pick up in verse 10 at the end of that section entitled, The Shepherds Removed. Okay. Again, this is the critique through Ezekiel. Verse 10. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I now consider these shepherds my enemies, and I will hold them responsible for what has happened to my flock. I will take away their right to feed the flock, and I will stop them from feeding themselves. I will rescue my flock from their mouths. The sheep will no longer be their prey. Dang. So guys, basically, these are such strong words, man. He's like, I'm going to remove them. I'm going to hold them accountable for what they've done. I'm going to take the flock away from them. I'm going to rescue my flock from their mouths. My sheep will no longer be their prey. You know what he's referring to here? He's telling the shepherds they become like wolves. Now, they've stopped tending the sheep, but they've started to act like wolves who prey upon the sheep. That's why he says, I will rescue my sheep from their mouths. They're saying, you guys have become like wolves who consume the sheep for your own benefit. You've turned them into prey. And sheep, if you don't know much about sheep and shepherding in that time, in ancient times, a shepherd, because we think about sheep in a pen and in an enclosure typically, or on a farm, and it's sequestered, right? They can't go outside of a certain area. Back then, shepherds would lead their sheep all across huge areas of land to find good pastures. The shepherd would lead the sheep all through hundreds of miles to different pastures and different waters. But so without a shepherd, the sheep would be scattered and they would die. They could fall into the water and drown. They could become prey to wolves and other animals. They could get caught in thickets and just starve to death. They could fall down into ravines. Sheep without a shepherd in a large, vast area would scatter and die. Without a shepherd, without a leader or leaders, there was no one to guide them around, keep them safe. But it was this idea of this roving and moving kind of shepherd-sheep relationship. And so it was so important that sheep had a shepherd to guide them, because without it, it's not like they could just wander inside an enclosure and be safe, because they were traveling hundreds and hundreds of miles around, right? And so he's charged the current shepherds with abuse and self-centered, like self-aggrandizing and self-focused approach in their leadership. He said, I'm going to remove you. And then he spends 11 through 24 talking about what a good shepherd should look like and how he will bring a good shepherd to the people that won't do all these bad things. We're going to just read verse 24, which sums up this section about the good shepherd, right? And you know where I'm going. Verse 24, and I will set over them one shepherd, my servant David. He will feed them and be a shepherd to them. Okay? Very important. This obviously, we know this points to Jesus, and this is why Jesus calls himself the Good Shepherd. But I want you to understand something, and this relates specifically to the church today. Through the prophet Ezekiel, God first says, I'm tired of all these other shepherds that I've appointed over my people and how they treat the flock, how abusive they are. As a remedy, I'm removing them, but what? He's like, I'm not going to bring in another group of shepherds. I'm going to bring in one shepherd. He calls them my servant David. And as we know, the Messiah was to be descended from the line of David. And so there's two different key things here. One is that this servant is descended from David, from the line of David. And two, that it is one shepherd. What do we call our pastors of churches today? Shepherds over a flock. That is wrong. Your pastor, or a pastor, is not a shepherd over a flock. Jesus never intended nor set down in Scripture that any church leader would be a shepherd over the flock, or that people would follow those leaders. Jesus has always intended that we follow him. Jesus was making a change. He was also fulfilling this prophecy that he would be the one shepherd now over God's people. That we would no longer have a multiplicity of shepherds, that we would no longer look to human leaders to lead us, but that we would have one shepherd, Jesus. Your pastor is not your shepherd. Your pastor is not the person you are meant to be following. This is in no way unclear in the New Testament. Let's jump to John chapter 10. Okay. Jesus is talking about the idea of this good shepherd, okay? And he says, the one who enters through the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep recognize his voice and come to him. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. After he has gathered his own flock, he walks ahead of them, and they follow him because they know his voice. I'm going to stop there for a sec. Verses 2 through 4, Jesus sets up this idea. He's the new kind of shepherd, this new type of shepherd that's going to lead God's people now. And what does he say? He's the shepherd. There are gatekeepers which watch over the sheep in a pen. Okay, so this is the paradigm. You have this pen. There are sheep in a pen that are put there for their protection. But that's not where they live, and that's not where they're meant to live. The gatekeeper is in the same section. He calls the gatekeeper the hired hand. The gatekeeper and the hired hand is meant to help Jesus for a time watch over his flock. But Jesus specifically says when he comes to the pen where the gatekeeper is helping watch over the sheep, the gatekeeper is meant to open the gate for Jesus so that Jesus can do what? Not come into the pen and do some stuff with the sheep and then leave again, but so he can lead the sheep out of the pen, away from the gatekeeper, through all these pasture lands, right? Like a normal shepherd would. And so Jesus kind of sets forth this paradigm here concerning the local church body. He says, yes, it's my desire that there would be gatekeepers and hired hands who function with a leadership role in the church as commissioned by me, who help me tend the sheep. But the point is that there should be a point at which every single person shifts from following mature spiritual elders to following Jesus. We need, especially when we're new converts and young converts to Christianity, we need human elders to mentor us. But there should come a time when we grow to a point where we no longer need leaders to tell us what to think, tell us what to believe, tell us how to behave, and keep us locked in the pen for our safety. There should come a time when we are mature enough to then start to follow Jesus throughout the whole world, because we've learned how to recognize his voice. Jesus never sets up shepherds over his flock. He is the shepherd. He sets up gatekeepers who are meant for a time to mentor people to the point at which they can follow Jesus for themselves, because he is the shepherd. We need to learn how to follow Jesus as mature disciples throughout the world that we live in. As we go through our lives day to day, we should come to a point where we know Jesus, we hear his voice, we can follow him, and we can begin to be mature Christians in the world, spreading the fragrance of Jesus, right? I talked about the aroma of Christ. If we simply have a concept that really keeps us locked in the pen, and we don't know how to be Christians outside the pen, and we're not mature enough, and we really are very fearful of attempting to be Christ followers outside of that place, and really know how to lead people to Christ ourselves and follow Christ for ourselves without that kind of paradigm, that's a problem, okay? Jesus specifically shows us the difference between himself as a shepherd and church leaders as gatekeepers. And then he calls them, we're going to jump to verse 11. Again, he's laying out this paradigm of, he's making a distinction between church leaders, church elders, and himself as the shepherd. Verse 11, Jesus is continuing laying out this paradigm of how he thinks the church should work. Okay, verse 11, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd sacrifices his life for the sheep, right? He says, a hired hand will run when he sees a wolf coming. He will abandon the sheep because they don't belong to him, and he isn't their shepherd. And so the wolf attacks them and scatters the flock. Verse 13, guys, this is critical. The hired hand runs away because he's working only for the money and doesn't really care about the sheep. Woo! Bam! I mean, okay, guys. Jesus is laying out a paradigm of church and his people as they congregate together to grow into him and learn how to follow him. Jesus does not give a very glowing picture of the hired hands that he has appointed over his sheep. He says they don't belong to him. He, the hired hand, will abandon the sheep because they don't belong to him. You don't belong to your pastor. You don't belong to your church. You belong to Jesus. Your church, your pastor are there to help you learn how to belong to Jesus. Stop claiming you belong to a church. You are the church. Stop claiming you belong to a pastor or follow a pastor. You don't follow your pastor. You don't follow your church. You follow Jesus. That's it. If you're a Christian, a little Christ, you're a follower of Jesus. You belong to Jesus. You don't belong in a pen. You don't belong to a hired hand. Jesus is really clear. Your pastor does not know how to protect you, is not capable of protecting you when life throws you curveballs. You can't run back to your church and look for help in that moment. The moment's gone, guys. If you don't know how to speak Christ to people in the moment, whether they're attacking you or just curious, then you don't know how to follow Christ and how to lead others to follow Christ. You're not trying to bring people back to the pen because they're not sheep yet, right? Jesus is, I think it's very scathing. Jesus is very scathing towards church leaders in this description. He says, the hired hand runs away because he's working only for the money and doesn't really care about the sheep. Bam! I mean, guys, it's pretty harsh. Granted, of course, your pastor cares about you. But in today's paradigm, especially especially in a church that's falling apart. What do pastors really care about? Do they really care about the sheep? Or do they care more about money and their own prominence and popularity? Well, I think Jesus lays it out clearly. Like, we're not meant to find protection in a building under a group of church leaders. That's not protective, guys. It's not going to protect you. It's not going to protect you from the wolves in the world, whether that's unbelievers or whether that's evil spirits or whether there's all kinds of attacks that are going to come. And having a good pastor and a good church that you attend once a week aren't going to protect you. It's not how it works. And Jesus points to the fact that in the church paradigm, it shouldn't be surprising that church leaders will care more about their own needs at times than the needs of others. They're not the shepherd. You can call them the shepherd, they're not. Especially today, pastors and churches are much more concerned about their own prominence and the money they're bringing in than caring for the flock. They are, just as Jesus describes them, hired hands. They work with Jesus to help teach people to know Jesus so people can walk with Jesus. But push comes to shove, they're not the shepherd. They're not going to lay their life down for the sheep. They're not going to sacrifice for the sheep. We've gotten to the place where church leaders are very much like the shepherds in the time of Ezekiel. They're really perpetuating a system of church that benefits them the most. And they're leaving the flock unguarded, scattered, injured, hurt, lost, and wandering. There's a lot more to unpack in those ideas, which is what we're going to do. This first episode, what I want you to understand most is that the gatekeepers of every local church, which are the pastors, are meant to teach people how to follow the shepherd so that they can open the gate and let the sheep go out. They're not supposed to cloister the sheep in and protect them and keep them and control them for their own benefit and use them for their own benefit so they can be the only ones actually spreading the gospel. Got it? All right. Thanks, guys, for listening. This has been a Construction Monk podcast. I'm your host, Jay Randall Stewart. Again, we are starting and going to go through a lot of conversations around this topic of let my people go and how the church has gotten to this place where it's keeping people from following Jesus instead of teaching them to follow Jesus. All right? All right. Good.